Hello, I'm glad you're watching this. And the reason I'm glad you're watching this is that I hope you are learning that we are not meant to read Scripture on our own. That the Word that God speaks through Scripture is spoken to His people, us personally, us together, so that as we hear, so that as we converse, so that as we go deeper, we know what it means to be a part of God's people, to be a part of the people that God is using in God's mission to change all things. One of the fundamental things that we do to recognize that we are not reading Scripture on our own is pray. Every time we open the book we love, this bush that burns and is never consumed, the first thing we must do is pray. Because the hope is that as we are reading, God is speaking. That as the word is open, our ears are open, not just to the words on the page, but to God speaking through the words on the page. And in the middle of our questions, our convictions, our wonderings, our conversations with others, our studying scripture, our gathering on Sundays, the hope is that God would speak so that we would know God's heart, so that we would know who we are in relationship to God, and know God's compassion, mercy, and grace for others. I'm glad we're doing this. We are coming this week to Matthew chapter 20, verses 17 to 28. And in the big picture, Jesus is getting near the end. Matthew tells us this geographically. Jesus is on his way up to Jerusalem. And as he's on the way up, he makes this prediction, telling his disciples that he is near the end. Jesus knows the end is coming. And again, as I've been trying to stress, he is trying to make a few things clear that his way, that his mercy, that his love for the disciples is to transform all things about the disciples. So this week, as we enter into that, as we try to keep that real, you might notice that there are four parts to our scripture. It's the word about going up, this prediction. It's the request of the mother of the sons of Zebedee. It's the conflict that creates, and then the call of Jesus as he calls those disciples back together. So first you have this prediction, then you have the request of the mother and the conversation that follows, the division that creates, and then the call of Jesus as he brings his disciples back to him to teach them his way of servant leadership. So what I'd like you to do is read the scripture passage and answer two questions about all four parts. The first question is, what happens in this part? And second, what is Matthew trying to show and tell us as the disciples of Jesus? Two questions for each of the four parts. What happens? What is Matthew trying to show and tell us? So stop the video, read through the passage, all four parts, those two questions, and then come back. You're back. Now that you're back, um, I want to walk through those four parts to share with you some of the things that I see happening, and then to think about what Matthew might be showing and telling us as the disciples of Jesus. So Jesus is going up to Jerusalem. First, the narrator tells us that, and then Jesus pulls the disciples aside and says, "We are going up to Jerusalem." So they're going, then Jesus is taking them aside and he is telling them. And the focus on what he tells them is on all that will happen to the Son of Man. This is one of Jesus' ways of referring to himself. Um, so Jesus says that he will be handed over to the teachers and the chief priest. They will hand him over to the Romans, who will mock him, flog him, and crucify him, and then he will be raised from the dead. One of the things that I think Jesus is doing that Matthew is trying to show and tell us is the full extent of which Jesus is giving himself away. That doing the will of the Father, living into God's call to love the whole world, Jesus is coming to give himself away. And we see that in all of those verbs. This movement up is a movement to give himself away. It's been called the passive of love, that Jesus enters into all these things, and all these things then happen to him. And to really understand that, we have to understand and hear what Jesus says in Matthew 26:53, when Judas comes leading those who will arrest Jesus. One of the disciples whips out a sword and slices off the chief priest's servant's ear, and Jesus says, "Put your sword back. Don't you know that I could at any moment call on a legion of angels?" I mean, Jesus has the power, he has the authority to go a different way, to stop what is happening. But Matthew is showing and tell us that Jesus knows what has happened. He has the power to do something else, and yet he is entering into this way of self-giving. And he's doing it with the end in mind, that he will be raised from the dead. So that's where this begins. The next thing that happens is that the mother of the sons of Zebedee, John and James, two of the original four disciples, comes to Jesus with a request. And this is really fascinating. Catherine and I talked about this, to think about what a mother wants for her sons. What does a mother want for her children? And how do we see that driving this mother to come to Jesus, to kneel before him and ask for a favor, to make a request? And what does then happen? Jesus is open to hearing from her. He engages both her and her sons in this conversation about their request. And it all circles around Jesus coming into his kingdom, and the disciples' future of sharing in his kingdom, which he expresses in the language of the cup. Can you drink the cup I'm going to drink? He asks the disciples, and they say, we can. And he says, oh, you will. If you want to think about what Jesus is saying, and you want to think about that in the fullness of the biblical story, it might help to go and read Isaiah 51. Which is one of the primary references to this cup that Jesus is talking about. When he goes into Gethsemane, he's going to pray, Father, take this cup away from me. And then on the cross, what's he going to say? I thirst. This is an image that Jesus is using. And it's really interesting for us to think about what is Jesus saying, and how does Matthew trying to show and tell us what it means to be his disciples. Specifically as it relates to sharing in his way of suffering, sharing in his way of serving, sharing in his way of going up to Jerusalem to take the way down of the servant. The third thing that happens in this passage is that the 10 hear about the request of the two, and it creates, as the NIV says, animosity, which is a really nice word for saying they were super angry, and there was division. But Jesus calls them back together, right? So there's this request. It's a request for power. It's a request for privilege. It's a request for something good, and the two are willing to say that. The 10 resent it, and there's division. But Jesus calls them back together. Which I think part of what Matthew is trying to show and tell us is that even with Jesus, the fullness of God dwelling in him, the disciples end up divided. There's conflict. There is differences in will that creates division, even when Jesus is there. But Jesus is opening up a way through that. And what he does in the fourth section is compare the way that Gentile leaders lead with the way that disciples are called to lead. So if you want to be great, you become a servant. If you want to be first, you become a slave. And all of that is grounded in the way that Jesus, the Son of Man, has come, not to be served, not to sit on a throne and have waiters, but to be the waiter, to be the servant. Think about John chapter 13, when Jesus takes off the towel and serves. What he shows us in John, Matthew is telling us, Jesus is saying it, that the way to greatness, the way to be a great leader is to be the servant, because that's what the Son of Man comes to do. He comes to serve and to give himself as a ransom for all, or for many, as some translations put it. What is Jesus saying right there at the end? What is Matthew trying to show and tell us? That Jesus, who makes the prediction at the beginning, knows where this is all going, and who it's all for. So if you want to think about a ransom, or a loosening, or a liberation, a saving act that frees others, you might go read Isaiah 53 verses 10 to 12. Because that's kind of the Old Testament background that Matthew and Jesus have in mind that help us explain what Jesus is up to. So there's a really quick introduction to this scripture passage that has 4 parts, that shows us both Jesus' power, authority, his servant way, and the way that he is calling us to follow him in service.